All right, so for this video, we're going to go over how to model this sort of bus shelter enclosure in Rhino 7. So um, if you haven't already, go ahead and open up Rhino 7. And to start, we are going to we can go to any of these side views. So we'll go to like a right view. We'll expand our right view. And if we look at the image, the way that we're going to tackle modeling this is we're going to start off by drawing a set of lines that correspond with this sort of enclosure that also leads into this base. So that's the first step we're going to do in trying to tackle modeling this shelter. So in our right view, we can go ahead and we can type in, first let's type in the command line. So line is going to allow us to draw just a single line segment. So we'll pick any point, and well, first let's go ahead and at the very bottom where we have all of our different snaps, we'll go ahead and we'll turn a grid snap on. So now that we have grid snap on, let's pick a point and let's draw a line that is 11 feet long. So to type in that, to get that length, what you'll do is you'll just type in 11, and you can specify feet, but if your model is already in feet, which is here at the bottom, if it's already in feet, then you don't need to specify feet. You can just type in 11 and then click to end the command. To verify the length of that line, you could select it and you could type in the command length, and you can see at the top that it says that that line is 11 feet. Another way that you could verify the distance of that curve that you just drew is by typing in the command distance, which is going to ask you to pick a first point for reference, and then pick a second point, and then click, and you'll see that once again it says that that line is 11 feet. So going back to that form, so let's go ahead and let's do a polyline. So a polyline is going to be a number of straight lines. So let's do another polyline that's 11 feet, and then we'll do another one at 11 feet to create this this sort of like cube that would represent this volume that's being created. Then what we'll go ahead and do is let's imagine that that bit there goes 6 feet back. So we'll draw a 6-foot line and hit enter, and then we'll draw another line that is 11 feet. Now there's a couple of ways that we can, so what we want is we want, if you were to follow the cursor, you want a line that goes from this point and this point to that midpoint of that 11-foot volume. So there's a couple different ways that we could do that. So the first would be we could, if we go down here to our snaps, and if we make sure that midpoint is turned on, we can just type in the polyline command, and we can draw a polyline from this corner to the midpoint of this line, and then to the next corner. And that's probably the easiest way to do it. Now, another way that you could go about splitting a line into its multiple points is by selecting a line and typing in the command divide. And so it's going to ask for the number of segments, and ours is already set to 2 segments. So we'll go ahead and hit enter, and you will see that it has divided that line into 2 lines, to 2 curves instead of 1 open curve. So now what we'll go ahead and do is we will once again we'll type in polyline to create the line that is going to run through that point, like so. Now we can go ahead and we can delete these reference lines that we used to get that form. And if you haven't already, go ahead in the command line, we're going to type in the command selection filter. Selection filter. And what that's going to do is it's going to bring up this. It'll more than likely it'll place it here in the modeling space, and this is going to allow you to choose what your cursor is going to select, and it's also going to allow you to select sub-objects. So if you wanted to only allow the selection of one thing and not all the others, you will right-click on a checkbox, and you'll see that it'll turn all the other ones off. So now I can only select curves. Now if I say I only wanted to select surfaces, I'd right-click on surfaces, and now I can't select the curves because the selection filter will not allow me to. To disable them, you'll just right-click again on disable, and it'll turn them all on. So then you can select everything. Now what we want to do is with our selection filter, we want to select sub-object. You'll use the selection filter a lot, so good practice is every time you start a file, open it and drag it over in this area by your properties panel. So with sub-objects on, we're going to go ahead and we're going to select this line, this curve that we drew originally to create that enclosure, and then we're just going to delete it. Now if we turn sub-objects off and we go through here, we'll see that there are 3 different curves. So also another way to check the quality of the curves is you can select them, and in your properties panel you'll see that it says 3 open curves. It'll also say 3 curves added to selection in the command line. Now what we want to do is we want to join these curves together. So to join them, you just select all of them and you type in the command join. Additionally, you can use the hotkey Control-J to use the join command. So now that we have those, we have these lines. What we want is if we go back to our, so this is kind of the the base of that enclosure, but there's also this bit here at the top that kind of grows off, and if we look, it seems to be at that same angle as this piece here. So what we want to do is we want to use the command subcurve, and we'll select that curve that we joined, and we'll pick this as the starting point, and let's go ahead and let's do a curve that is 3.25 quarter feet. And you'll want to make sure that when you do subcurve that you have copy set to yes. So if we have copy set to no, what it's going to do is it's going to shorten this curve and delete all the rest of the curve. So it'll trim it. So with copy set to no, here's what it'll do. You'll see that it'll delete everything but that portion there. We want copy set to yes, and we will select our curve, and we'll draw, starting from this point, we'll go down 3.25 feet. And then we'll just click to subdivide it, and then we'll go ahead and we'll select this curve that we just made, and we'll type in move to move it. So we'll grab it from this bottom point, and then move it to here, and then once again we can evaluate the what these curves are doing by if we select them, it'll say 2 open curves, and we want them to be 1 open curve. So we'll once again type in join or Control-J to join them into 1 open curve, which you can see it now says 1 open curve in the object properties panel. So now let's go ahead and let's go to our let's go over to the perspective view. So from our perspective view, the next step that we're going to take is we want this to, we want this to not just be a line. We want it to be something 3-dimensional. So we are going to type in the command extrude curve, and let's go ahead and let's do 17 feet. Yeah, let's do 17 feet for our extrude curve, and then we'll click or hit enter to finish the command, and you'll see that if your viewport is set to wireframe, you might be confused thinking, well, it just looks like it made more curves. It doesn't look like it made a surface. This is a really common thing that a lot of people have when they're first learning Rhino. So the way to fix your viewport property is by clicking on this drop-down arrow in the perspective window, and then you go to shaded instead. Now, in case you are struggling switching between viewports, to go from one viewport to another, you simply double-click on a view to either maximize it so it takes up the whole view, or you can go back to this, this 4-page layout. But we're going to go back to our big perspective view. So now that we have, we have this, this general form, the issue is that the building itself is not just these singular planes. There's a thickness to it. And this is really important for when you're trying to create a sense of realism, is capturing all the essence of it. So what we're going to do is, before we actually create this thickness, something else that I want you to note is that there isn't an abrupt shift between each of these planes. That edge is it's curved. So we're going to actually do that to our model as well. So we're going to use the fillet surface. I'm not really sure what the correct way to do it or the correct way to say it is, but that's what we're going to be using. So when you do this, it's going to ask for a radius for the surfaces that you're going to be curving, and that's really the only thing you need to worry about. So it's going to ask for you to select your first surface and then your second surface. And if you see, I had that set to 0.08, which I'm not sure what the equivalent would be in inches, but that clearly wasn't right. So let's try setting the radius to like 1/2 foot. And a lot of this is just trial and error, seeing what works and what doesn't work. So let's select those two. I still don't think that that's drastic enough. So now let's try setting it to 1 foot. Once again, we'll select that first surface and the second surface. And I think that's closer to what we want. Now, in case you are wondering how to repeat a command, especially if you are going through and trying something over and over again. So after you type in a command for the first time, and you do it, you don't like it, so you do Control-Z to undo. What you'll end up doing to repeat a command is just right-click or hit Enter. Either will work, and it will just repeat the last command that you did. So then you can select these surfaces again. Now, additionally, let's say that you undo something and then you want to redo it because you didn't mean to undo it, or maybe you decided that you wanted to actually go with what you did. You use Control-Y to redo something. Additionally, you can always type in things like redo in the command line or undo, but it's a lot faster to just memorize and learn those hotkeys. Control-Z for undo is pretty self-explanatory, but the Control-Y is a little different from pretty much every other software. So keeping that in mind when you're learning Rhino can be very, very beneficial. So we're going to go through and we're going to go surface by surface using that fillet surface. We'll select one surface. We'll select that next one. Then once again, to repeat the command, we will just right-click again, select our first surface, select our second surface, and we'll just keep going surface by surface until we've done them all. Now that we have them all, you'll see that if we click on each one, they say that they are just individual surfaces, which was what we wanted when we were doing that last command. But in order to offset them so that they all offset uniformly and it looks very clean and there's no weird overlaps or transitions, what we want to do is we want to select all those surfaces and join them together. So a great set of commands is, if you're ever trying to select a specific thing like curves or surfaces, you can just type in SEL for select, and then you can type in exactly what you want to select. So in this case, we want to select only the surfaces, not the curves. So we'll type in SEL, SRF for select surface, and then hit Enter, and you'll see that it selected all of those surfaces. And then once again, we're going to use that join command. So you can either type in join, or you can use Control-J as the hotkey. And it'll say that it joined those, and if you look over in the object properties panel, it says that the type of object is now a open polysurface. So a polysurface meaning that it is no longer a set of individual surfaces that are not joined. It is one continual surface that is made up of smaller surfaces. It doesn't seem like it would be important for it to be a polysurface, because it in some ways seems like the same thing, but it's important for especially offsetting surfaces that you join those surfaces together, especially if when you get into modeling a building and you have some sort of very complex form, having all those surfaces joined together ensures that that surface offset is going to be uniform. So once we offset that surface, now that we have joined that surface, now we are going to offset the surface. So in case you haven't guessed, we're going to use the command offset surface. And we can set the distance for the offset. We can select if we want it to be a solid or not, and we can select if we want to delete the input. So basically what each one of those means is, so the distance is kind of self-explanatory. So that is the distance from that surface that you want to offset. Solid is going to determine whether or not that offset is going to be a solid object, or if it is just going to be that surface offset. So I'll go ahead and do that. So we'll turn the solid off and we'll offset it, and you'll see that it offsets the surface and they're not connected. It's literally just the surface being offset. Now if we repeat that command and we select this poly surface and we turn solid to yes the way we want it, now the other thing is that delete input. So when we have delete input set to yes, what it means is when we go to do this, so we hit enter, we will now, all we have is that offset surface, that closed poly surface that is making up that form. Now if we set the delete, if we do the offset surface again, and then select delete input to no, now you'll see that when we offset the surface, that we can also select that original poly surface that was our offset surface. And this can be beneficial for when you are, when you're trying things and you're trying to figure out what looks good or what works, what doesn't work. I highly encourage that you uncheck delete input, because it's much harder to, then go through here. So, say you want your original input, now you have to turn sub-objects on and you need to select each of these faces by shift clicking, which is a lot more tedious than just keeping that original poly surface to begin with. So back to here with, we're going to go ahead and select that poly surface. We'll type in the command offset surface. We're going to offset at a distance of 0.5 feet with solid set to yes and delete input set to no. We'll hit enter, and now we have thickness to our volume, which is very important. So at this point, I think it would be a good time for us to do a little bit of layer organization, and we'll do some more as we go on later. So the layers panel is going to be to your right, and it's going to be in this, the icon is going to look kind of like a slice of a pie. So we're going to click on that, and you'll have your default layer and all of your other layers that you have. We really don't need any of these layers. We can just delete those, but we'll create a new layer, and we'll call this one the base curve. We can create another layer, and we will call this the base surface. And we'll create another layer called the enclosure. Now to change which layer that you're working on, all you have to do is double click on a layer, and you will see that it will bold it, and that means that that's the layer you're currently working on. Now to change the layer that something is on, you select the object. So we'll select this enclosure object first. We'll go to our properties panel. We'll go to layer. We'll go to the drop down, and you'll set this one to enclosure. Then we want to select our original surface. Go to layer, and we'll change this one to the base surface. Finally, we'll select that curve, which is kind of hidden, but you can see in there. So we'll select that curve, and we'll change the layer of that to base curve. Now to change the visibility of a layer, it's very similar to SketchUp. You have your little light bulbs that indicate turning a layer off and on, which allows you to control what's visible and what's not visible. Additionally, if you want to select all of the objects in a layer, you right-click on the layer that you want to select from, and you go to the option to select objects, and then that will select all of the objects that are on that layer. All right, so now that we have a little bit of layer organization taken care of, we're going to go ahead, and if we go back to our original photo, we're going to work on creating these columns, and then there's this beam that runs across there. So we're going to draw those. So I think the best way to go about doing this is we're going to use the dupe edge command, which is going to allow us to duplicate the edge of a surface. So we're going to select this edge to duplicate. We'll hit enter to duplicate the edge. So now where that edge is, we have a curve. Then we're going to use the command offset to offset that curve inward. And we want to offset that, let's do like 1.5 feet. I think that might be a good distance. And then we can go ahead and delete our original curve. Then let's go ahead and let's do subcurve, SUB, CRV, to shorten that curve. And in this case, we're actually going to turn copy to no. And we want this bottom curve here to be, let's have this be like 1.75 feet. And that seems a little, if we go to our reference image, that seems like that might just be a little bit close. So we can select it. And if we have gumball on, that means that we can just use this slider to move it. In this case, we'll probably turn grid snap off so we can just move it in little increments. Okay, so I think a distance like that might be a little bit more fitting. Then we're going to take this curve, and we're going to type in the command extrude curve. And with all of your snaps on, you can just select the bottom of this surface, and that's where it will extend to. You see there, it's snapping to that, so it'll just extend to that length. Now, this isn't wholly accurate because if you look here, it kind of widens out at the top. So I think what we can do is, let's go ahead and let's select just this column, and let's type in the command isolate. So that's the only thing that we're looking at. Now, what we want is, we want that top to be wider. So we're going to turn on subobjects. We're going to select the top of this surface. And we're going to type in the command scale 1D. Now, we can kind of play around with it, but I think something like 1.5 might look good. So let's do 1.5 as our scale 1D, which means that the entirety of the top is actually going to be 3 feet because you're scaling it so that that length from each side from that midpoint. So if I go back, so when we do scale 1D, we're going to select the midpoint, and then the edge is our reference point, and then that distance between the midpoint and the edge, we're going to set that to be 1.5 feet, which means the entirety of it is going to be 3 feet. You'll see that now it has this nice taper to it. We can select that surface, and now we can type in the command show to turn everything else on. Now if we look, I think that might still be a little bit close, so we're going to move it back just a little bit more. What we'll go ahead and do is we'll select that surface, and this is a case where you could use offset surface, but another surface that you should have in your arsenal, another command you should have in your surface arsenal is extrude surface. So we're going to use extrude surface in this case. And we want this to be, let's do like 3/4 of a foot. I think that's a nice thickness. Looks structural. Now once we have this column set up, make sure sub-objects are off so you can just select that poly surface. Now we don't really necessarily need this surface anymore. That was our base surface. One option would be, if you're still undecided on what you're doing, if you aren't sure if you like it or not, I highly recommend that you save every base surface on its own layer. So you could have a new layer called like column, and you could have a sub layer. So you could have column, and then you could have a sub layer called base surface. And on this base surface layer for the column, that's where you could put this original surface that you were working with. So you go to base surface, and then now you see that that's off. Now to get another one of these columns on the other side, we're going to use a very handy command called mirror. And it's very self-explanatory, so it's going to mirror along an axis. So we're going to select, with midpoint on, we are going to snap across that axis. And so now we have those two columns running between them. Now if we look, we can kind of see how we're doing. I think that we're actually looking pretty good so far. What we'll do is we'll go ahead and once again we will select these columns, these poly surfaces, and we're going to isolate them. And we are going to create, by typing in polyline, we're going to create a planar surface that runs across the top of them. And this is actually going to be our beam. But actually, if we look, that beam is kind of offset inward. So let's actually not do that. Let's create just two lines on the sides, like so, on the long sides. I'm going to offset each one. Let's do a quarter of a, so it'll be 3 inches. So we'll do 0.25 feet, or 3 inches inward. And we can go ahead and delete those exterior ones. Then with those two lines running across, we can select them, type in the command loft to create a surface between those two curves. And now we have that surface. And you'll have something like this pop up and it's going to say rebuild. You're really not going to mess with these very often. You just usually keep the style to normal and you'll be fine. So hit OK. Then we can go ahead and let's extrude this surface to create that thickness for that beam. So we'll type in the command extrude surface. And let's do 1 foot for that thickness of that beam. Now the issue is this beam is crossing into our columns, and that's, it's not a huge deal when you're modeling, but when you come to rendering, you really don't want any odd intersections like that because they'll have weird material overlaps. So we're going to select this column that we've made, and we're going to type in the command split. And it's going to ask for us to select our cutting objects. So we will select our 2 columns as our cutting objects, and then we will hit enter. And you'll see that it's going to isolate this, and it's going to say something at the top like 4 objects split into 16 pieces, which isn't really important, but it's a good way to see if your split works. So in our case, our split did work. So we are then going to type in the command isolate once again, so we can just see what we split. And now that it's isolated, it's very easy for us to just select these sides that got split and delete those. Now that we've trimmed that, we can go ahead and type in the command show to end our isolation. And we're looking pretty good. Now, now it's a good time to go ahead and do some layer organization. So we're going to create, let's put these 2 under the column layer that we created earlier. So we'll go to our properties panel, layers, click the drop down, we'll set it to column. And then let's create another layer, and we'll call this one the beam. So we'll go ahead and select the beam, and we'll go to our properties panel, and we'll set the beam to the beam layer. Now, when you really start modeling complex projects, I find it very tedious to constantly be switching between layers while you're working. So what I usually do is, say that I'm working on a very large scale project, and I'm working on the first floor. So I usually create a layer called like first floor build layer, and this is just a layer. So I'll, like say I was doing the first floor of a building, I use this layer to do a lot of my modeling, and then I intermittently go through and organize layers. It's easier. I find it easier. Some people might think it's easier to work in specific layers, but as your projects start getting really complex, like one of my last projects, layers and sublayers, I had close to like 300 layers total. So kind of breaking it up into bite-sized pieces is, in my opinion, the way to go as your products start, they get really complex as you keep going. So that's my suggestion. That's my 2 cents, and do with it what you will. But now that we have our model, we have all of our layers organized, the only thing that we have left to do is let's build this step, and you can build a base to kind of go around the entire thing. So if you were to do some sort of rendering, you'd have some sort of base. So to get that step, we're going to turn sub-objects on. We will select that edge. We will type in the command extrude curve. And you're going to see that it's automatically going to try to get that extrusion to go in the Z direction when we want it to actually go the other direction. So it's going to, on the top, it's going to say the direction. And so you're going to click on this thing that says direction. It's going to ask for a base point. So we'll select the midpoint. And then it's going to ask for your second direction point. And we will select this corner point here. And now we can extrude in this direction instead of vertically. So, I don't know, we'll make this step like, let's do, I don't know, 2 feet. And we'll select that surface again, which another way to select the last thing you're working on is to type in the command SEL and then last, so cell last. You'll see that it selects that surface that you just created. and then you will type in the command extrude surface. And we will extrude that surface to this point. So now we have that step. Now the last thing that we'll go ahead and do is let's create some sort of base to go around it, in case we were creating some sort of model. So for that, we'll go ahead and we can just use the rectangle tool. And we can just draw some sort of, we'll turn grid snap on and we can draw just some sort of enclosure or some sort of, we'll turn sub objects off. And we have this this closed curve. And we can go ahead and kind of mess with it until it looks to our liking. And we can go back to our perspective view. And if we click that closed curve and we type in the command planar surface, it will then generate a surface. Now, if we enlarge our perspective view by double clicking, you'll see that, okay, that's not quite right. That surface is cutting through. That is not what we wanted to do. That is because we drew on the C-plane, but our C-plane isn't where we want it, which isn't a huge deal. What we'll do is we'll just select this curve in the surface by highlighting over it, and we're just going to type in the command set point. And set point is going to allow us, it's going to bring up this this pop-up, and it's going to say set X, set Y, set Z, and we're going to unclick the others, and what we want is set Z. So we're going to hit set Z, OK, and it's going to ask for a reference point, so we'll click the bottom of that shelter, and you'll see that it moved that surface exactly to there. Now we can select that surface, type in the command extrude surface, and we can set that to some sort of distance that we want. So maybe it's, I don't know, 3 feet. Just so this is some sort of base. Then if we wanted to go and adjust our view settings, we could go to, maybe we want to set it to some sort of rendered view. Although rendered, you kind of lose some of the qualities of it. So I think sometimes Arctic is a little bit more effective. It's more like a clay render. It's not as high quality as a clay render, but it's not, it's a little bit more definition. Another thing that I can probably cover at another point is creating your own custom styles. So I have things like, this is colored hidden lines, so you can set colors to layers and then see all the colors. I have one that's just dark mode, colored hidden line, and that's where everything but the model is black. I have just your traditional hidden line, but with shading, so it's that sort of mix between the Arctic and hidden line. Hidden line, no shadow, so everything's black and white, and you have your lines. There's all these different ways that you can customize your viewport settings, and that's something that I can probably cover in another video. It's a little different, so we'll go ahead and do that another time. But for the most part, when you're working, you're going to be using shaded. I think that pretty much covers everything for this model. So that's going to go ahead and that's going to conclude the tutorial for this first model. So yes, that concludes this lesson, and I'll go ahead and I'll do the next one here in a little bit and upload that as well. All right, thank you guys.